Hey everyone, welcome to the Golden Hours with Zach Golden, and I figured I would start sort of a sub-series within the podcast where if there's a particular weekend where I don't have an interview lined up, then I would just sort of talk about a particular subject myself and just sort of speak from my own personal filmmaking experiences and offer, whatever sort of wisdom I've garnered over my journey as a writer and a filmmaker. And that said, I think what I wanted to talk about this weekend is sort of expanding on my podcast interview with Ethan Mauser. We talked a lot about the philosophy of writing, overcoming writer's block and procrastination. So if you're interested in hearing the rest of that, I would go check that out. I think Ethan offers a lot of valuable insight on overcoming those kinds of difficulties. And so just getting to know me and my struggle as a writer, I didn't actually discover the concept I didn't understand what filmmaking really was and that it was something people did for a living. I didn't understand that till I was 7 years old. And when I came to that realization, it completely blew my mind. And part of it was because I was just very confused on what movies were. Leading up to that, like I didn't understand how the pause button worked or how fast forward and rewind worked. I thought when you hit the fast forward button, all the actors and everything going on, they all were like living inside the TV, and they understood that when Zach hit the fast forward button, everyone had to do everything super fast, and then when Zach hit the pause button, everyone had to freeze. And I never understood how good they were at playing that game. And then I also didn't understand why every time I put that DVD in, didn't matter when, didn't matter what time, like how late in the day or how early in the morning, they were always ready to go, ready to play the movie for me. All the little people living in the TV. And it just really confused me. And when I started watching Star Wars, that messed with my head even more. Like, how in the world is Obi-Wan so old in A New Hope, but then all of a sudden he's super young in The Phantom Menace? And it just really, you can imagine being a dumb little 6-year-old just trying to understand what a TV was and what a movie was and what a story was. Then when I finally understood what a movie was, I was like, wow, I want to contribute to that somehow. And the quickest and most efficient way that sort of started happening in my life was writing stories. And for most of my childhood, through most of high school and a good portion of college life, I found myself starting stories and never being able to finish them. I would come up with a really cool idea, something that would get me really excited. And I'd be at work and I would come up with this idea or this situation, and I literally could not wait to get home from work and get in front of my laptop and start typing away. And I would get out my drawing journal, and I would draw out the characters that I'm seeing in my head. And I would be super excited about this idea that I came up with for about a week. And then after a week, after I've written, a couple 100 pages and drew like a dozen different characters, suddenly I'd hit this wall, and I would read over the thing that I had written, and I'd just be like, this is stupid. I don't like this. I don't get it. What's the point? And then I would basically put it in a folder and walk away. I did that probably north of 20 times across, my high school life, early college life. Who knows how many times I did that as a kid. Um, but I saved every one of those ideas, and it just became like this cyclical thing where I come up with a cool idea, I would work on it, I would invest time into it, and then I would just sort of give up. Breaking into the film industry feels impossible. Every aspiring filmmaker knows the struggle. Years of passion, countless hours studying cinema, and yet no clear path forward. The industry feels like a locked door and no one is giving you the key. I know that feeling because I've lived it. I grew up captivated by Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Pulp Fiction, Taxi Driver, so on and so forth. I went to film school expecting to walk out with connections and career opportunities. Instead, I graduated with 0 leads and a sinking feeling that my dream was slipping away. Everything changed when I uncovered the key lessons every successful filmmaker eventually learns, but no one is talking about. These lessons aren't found in film school or industry gatekeeping blogs. They came from real filmmakers doing the work, people who have found ways to break in, build careers, and make films outside the Hollywood machine. That's why I created my podcast, interviewing filmmakers from Bradenton and Sarasota who have actually made it happen. They're working, thriving, and proving that a career in the filmmaking industry is possible. Now I'm inviting you behind the scenes. Join my Patreon and get exclusive, unfiltered access to the knowledge and insights that can help you forge your own filmmaking path. Full-length, uncut podcast interviews are available with working filmmakers sharing their real experiences, struggles, and successes. There's going to be in-depth critiques where I break down storytelling, cinematography, and filmmaking techniques in some of my favorite films. There's going to be behind-the-scenes updates on my book, The Lodestar Manifest. There's also going to be a 7-day free trial for anybody who wants to try my Patreon out. There's also opportunities to explore an exclusive one-on-one collaboration with myself where I'll personally watch your film or read your script and give you practical, actionable feedback to elevate your work. If you're serious about filmmaking, this is where you start. Join now and let's create old stories today. Go to patreon.com/Zach Golden. And I don't know if giving up is the right word for it, but it was just, all the momentum would stop. And I wouldn't believe in my idea anymore. And I didn't really have a whole lot of exposure to other writers in my circle, at least not until after college. And so when I did find people who wrote, or I found videos on YouTube and just sort of trying to figure out what my problem was. It was this. Frankly, I was getting really bad advice, which was, you just haven't found the right idea yet, or you have to work on it until you find an idea you believe in. And I think I was just. I think at that time that wasn't the right advice for what I was experiencing. I think there were truths in what they were saying. But for my particular circumstance, that advice was not helpful to my problem. And my problem was not so much that I didn't believe in my ideas. It wasn't so much that I hadn't found the right one. It was that I didn't know the difference. This was my problem. I didn't know the difference between a story and a situation. And it didn't dawn on me that I didn't know the difference until after college. It's like, what's the difference between a story and a situation? Isn't a story just a whole bunch of situations thrown together? And it wasn't until I realized that there is a sure difference between a story and a situation that my entire framework for writing completely changed. And I found myself 100 times more invested in the stories I was writing. Because I believed in every story I was working on. I liked every single one of them. But I was writing situations, not stories. So what's a story then? What's the difference between a story and a situation? Well, the book that was integral to my understanding of what a story was a book written by Jill Chamberlain called The Nutshell Technique. And this book sort of shined a spotlight on how Hollywood writes scripts. And not just Hollywood in the sense of today's world, how, Marvel movies are written. It's not necessarily that surface level. I'm talking about how movies in the 80s were written, how movies in the 70s were written, how movies in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s, how stories and playwrights were written 100 years ago, 200 years ago. I'm talking about how mythology was written a couple of thousand years ago. The Nutshell Technique sort of shines a spotlight on these subconscious stories we didn't realize we were telling and how focused they were on the protagonist. And not just the protagonist, but his journey where he has to either step towards his strength or stick to his flaw. That is essentially what a story is. Is your protagonist going to move towards his strength or stick to his flaw? And I want to dive more into that on this podcast. So sort of in the vast landscape of screenwriting methodologies, like you've got, Joseph Campbell's A Hero's Journey, you've got Save the Cat, 27 Points. The Nutshell Technique that was sort of not discovered, but highlighted, I think is more accurate to say, by story consultant Jill Chamberlain. She offers a uniquely holistic and psychologically rooted structure for crafting emotionally resonant and narratively cohesive stories. Unlike The Hero's Journey or Save the Cat, the Nutshell Technique focuses on character transformation. It's all about the protagonist's internal conflict. And because it's all about the internal conflict, the better you get at writing and recognizing how to implement the Nutshell Technique into your story, the more you have thematic unity and aligning with the struggle that the protagonist is experiencing, whether he chooses to stick to his flaw or move towards his strength. And this is all aligning closely with the foundations that were sort of established by Aristotle. And if you haven't taken a film appreciation course, then you may or may not be familiar with the term comedy and tragedy in the playwright sense. Because when you think of comedy, you're thinking like, ha-ha, funny. But in a playwright, or at least in the Aristotelian sense of the word comedy and tragedy, it's a completely different definition. So, if a story is considered a comedy, that means that the protagonist steps away from his flaw and toward his strength. In other words, he starts off one way and he moves towards a better way. He evolves into something more. He steps away from a self-inflicted issue, and he resolves it and reconciles that issue by moving towards his strength. That is what an Aristotelian comedy is. Then there is Aristotelian tragedy, which is the exact opposite. Meaning he has a self-inflicted issue that never gets resolved. And he succumbs to that flaw in some form or fashion. And so, thinking in that context, you start to think, okay, what you just by philosophically exploring those ideas, you're immediately forced to consider, okay, who is my protagonist? What what self-inflicted issue does he have? What's his problem? And in what way does he reconcile that problem? How does he grow from that problem? How does he evolve? Do I even want him to evolve? Or do I want him to be sort of a tragic character who has every opportunity to step toward his strength, but he's so stubborn or prideful or angry or lustful or greedy that he never actually overcomes that problem, and maybe he dies because he never resolves that issue? Or maybe his life just never changes and it's always boring because he never steps out, you know, and accepts the call to adventure. Whatever that may be. Suddenly you're thinking philosophically, okay, who is my main character? And what kind of person is he? That already was changing my entire framework for how I wrote stories, because suddenly I wasn't writing about a series of events. Suddenly I was writing a story about a character who had some stuff to work on. And I don't know about you, but everybody has stuff to work on. So as soon as I started implementing that framework into my stories, they immediately felt more human. It felt like there was relatability. I suddenly liked my characters infinitely more. And I liked the story surrounding my character infinitely more. Because what I realized I needed to do was test my protagonist. I had to curate a circumstance that challenged my protagonist perfectly. I mean, if for example, if I had a protagonist who hated children, for whatever reason, he just doesn't like kids. And then I wrote a story where he goes on a business trip and he has to confront a dragon in order to get promoted to CEO. There's no coherence. There's no thematic unity in that story. That just feels like a situation. There's nothing that feels ironic or challenging in that story. But say you have a protagonist who doesn't like children. And then one day, his sister passes away. And by order of her will, this protagonist now has to raise his sister's 2 daughters. Suddenly, you have a protagonist whose disliking of children has just been challenged. Suddenly, you have more than just a situation. You have irony. And I think if there's one takeaway that the Nutshell offers writers, is that when you write a story, you should be thinking about what the irony is. What is the irony of your protagonist? What is his self-inflicted issue? And then what's the irony of the circumstance that protagonist enters into? Because that changes that circumstance from being a situation, and it actually turns it into a story that has meaning and has a lesson and has a purpose. And so maybe you struggle with your stories. Maybe you feel like You have cool ideas, but you just don't really. You have trouble connecting with your characters. You struggle figuring out what the point is. My encouragement to you is focus entirely on who you want the protagonist to be. Think of a self-inflicted issue that this person's going to have. Nothing like a broken leg, or maybe maybe they're blind. Like that's not a self-inflicted issue. Harry Potter, being bullied by his aunt and uncle, that doesn't count as being a self-inflicted issue. Now that's an obstacle, certainly an obstacle that he has to overcome, but that's not a self-inflicted issue. What is the self-inflicted issue that your protagonist has? What do they got to work on? What is a character thing that they need to work on? And whatever that thing they need to work on is, curate a situation, right? Curate a situation that forces your protagonist to confront that issue, to confront that flaw that they have to work on. And that turns your situation into irony, which creates a story. And after that, the question becomes, okay, does my protagonist overcome his issue? Does he successfully work on his self-inflicted problem? And does he come out on the other side a better person? Or is my story about a person who does not overcome his flaw, who is so prideful and stubborn that he sticks to his self-inflicted issue, and you're seeing the consequences of that mistake, right? Because it's not just about comedy or tragedy, right? Does your protagonist step towards his flaw, or does he stick to his flaw? We don't just stop there, because timing is everything, right? You resonate with a movie for a reason, and so much of that is because of timing. That certain events happen at certain points of the film, and because they happen at certain points of the film, the climax resonates with you. It's all about timing, and the nutshell technique knows this. It knows exactly when certain points need to happen so that your story is told in the best and most efficient way. And I'm not saying that if this type of thing doesn't happen in your script, then your story is no good. That's actually the opposite of what I'm saying. Because what the nutshell technique does that the hero's journey doesn't do, what the nutshell technique does that Save the Cat doesn't do, is it gives you a runway for your airplane. I love the hero's journey. I have an appreciation for Save the Cat. But what those two different techniques do is force you to tell a specific trope in your film, in your script. What Blake Snyder will insist is that if you don't have a Dark Night of the Soul moment in your script, then your story is not real and you're a bad writer. What I am here to tell you is that that's bullshit, okay? I think your story is perfectly capable of being the best version that it can be without a Dark Night of the freaking Soul moment, alright? And the nutshell technique recognized this. The nutshell technique actually wants you to tell your story the way you want to. And the way that it allows that is because, again, I go back to what I said earlier. The nutshell technique is ultimately all about whether or not the protagonist steps towards their strength or sticks to their flaw. And it's not just about whether or not they move to their strength or not. There's actually points in your script where you can highlight your protagonist's inner conflict in a way that gives you all sorts of creative freedom while also helping you build stakes, build momentum, create conflict. And it helps you deliver that character choice moment for your character without bogging you down with tropes and, 27 different points of structure. And I want to go over those points, those 8 elements of the nutshell technique. That's going to help you build the best version of your story. I want to go over the 8 elements that are going to help you land your plane on your runway the smoothest way possible. And so we're going to talk about that. But first, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone on Spotify and YouTube. You guys are great. Again, check me out on Patreon. There's low rates, there's awesome benefits, and you can have the first 7 days free. Hit me up on Patreon, and until then, we're going to cut.